Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement. So what we're going to be talking about is, especially as African American soldiers begin to come home from fighting in World War II, they are expecting things to be different in the South. They've fought for their country, they've been treated as war heroes, but when they get back to the South, what they find is that Jim Crow laws are still in effect, segregation is still the name of the game. And what this is going to do is it's going to lead African Americans and other races to really begin to push the civil rights movement. So we'd like to just review. Remember, we had that court case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that basically this separate but equal idea that you could have separate facilities as long as that didn't mean they weren't equal. Well, we know that that wasn't true in the South. We know that that segregation led to inequality, and so what's going to happen is that the civil rights movement is really going to try and figure out what to focus on to show this inequality, to bring forth to the courts how Plessy versus Ferguson needs to be overturned. I do think it's important to know that segregation and discrimination, inequality was not just found in the South. A lot of times we think that was it, but it was also in the North as well. They didn't have Jim Crow laws per se, but they did have segregation. And it was also found in some areas out in the West. So inequality and segregation was found throughout the United States. So when the civil rights movement leaders are trying to figure out where they should start, like how do you take on segregation? How do you prove that it is not equal? Well, what they decided was that they were going to look at segregation in schools because it was so easy to see how the facilities, the education that was being provided was not equal. And so this will bring about one of the most famous court cases, which is Brown versus the Board of Education. This will be Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka on May 17th of 1954. What will happen is when they bring this case forward, there's a girl named Linda Brown, and she was having to walk this huge long distance to be able to get to school, and just so that because she couldn't go to the all-white school just down the street. So this gets all the way to the Supreme Court, and at the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, who is Warren, they unanimously segregation in schools was a violation of the 14th Amendment, which gave equal protection under the law, and they overturned segregation. Let's watch a short video about this.
It's Jeremiah, and right now we're going to learn about the civil rights movement for kids. And today we're talking about a historic case in the U.S. Supreme Court called Brown versus Board of Education. Getting a good education is very important, and people travel to attend school here in the United States of America from around the world. From elementary schools to universities, you will see a diverse group of people from different nationalities filling up classrooms. But it wasn't always like that here in the United States. Actually, up until 1954, classrooms were quite different than they are today, not allowing African American students to attend school with white students there too. Now, I don't know about you, but that definitely doesn't sound fair to me. But this was allowed because of a previous court case in 1896 that said segregation was okay, which meant that schools could keep white and African American students separate. Now, there is an organization that still exists today called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP. This organization started to fight back with small efforts in the 1930s by fighting in courts around the countries that allowed segregation in school districts. Having success on a local and state level, they took their fight one step higher. The NAACP stood up to fight this unfair treatment in the highest court of the land, the United States Supreme Court. They had their counsel, Thurgood Marshall, argue the case in front of the Supreme Court to stop laws that made African Americans have to be separate in classrooms from white students. A fun fact about Thurgood Marshall is later he became the first African American Supreme Court justice on the United States Supreme Court in U.S. history. That is when on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court handed down its decision to strike down segregation in schools. With their decision, this forced schools who kept African Americans separate from whites to allow integration. What integration means is they had to make a way to integrate, meaning to bring African Americans back into the same classrooms mixed together with white students. The Supreme Court also helped by making rules to make sure that this got done, because a lot of times when laws got passed, people took their time because they wanted to keep things the way they were in the past. Later on, after the Supreme Court made these laws and gave guidelines, it changed the classroom environment that we are seeing today. And now you see integrated classrooms with all ethnicities being allowed in schools today. Well, that was all for me on a quick lesson with Brown versus the Board of Education and Civil Rights History for Kids.
So that was just kind of a short overview going over Brown versus the Board of Education. And as it said in the video, some states did refuse to desegregate, others said they would do it slowly. So what's going to end up happening is that some states, such as in Arkansas, the governor of Arkansas was going to refuse to allow students to come into these schools to integrate. And so we get what are called the Little Rock Nine. These are 9 African American students who are going to go in and try and desegregate Little Rock Central High School. The governor of Arkansas actually tried to get the National Guard of Arkansas to step in to refuse to let these students go to school. What's going to end up happening is that the federal government is going to have to come in and escort these students to school, going to have to help to keep them safe in order to allow for the desegregation of these schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 will be passed as we start to see more resistance to the civil rights movement. This will be the very first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction. You're talking almost 100 years before civil rights was really taken back up as a cause. Continuing in with this, the next person we're going to talk about is Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a woman who she worked every day, she rode the bus, and on December 1st, she took a seat in the front row of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and a white guy came on and said, "I want your seat." And legally, she was supposed to take and move to the back of the bus. That was what was required legally. And that day, she just had enough, and she said no and refused to give up her seat for this guy. When she refused to give up her seat, the bus driver tried to talk her out of it, and she said no. The police came and arrested her for not giving up her seat. What this does is when Rosa Parks just makes that simple no, I'm not going to give up my seat, it gives people who want equality and who want these equal rights for all, it gives them even more momentum to see that anyone can stand up. And this is going to lead the NAACP to boycott these buses due to the segregation that are segregated. So the NAACP is going to push for desegregation of these buses. And to lead their bus boycotts in Montgomery, they are going to choose an up-and-coming minister who's named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King will take on this. He will organize this bus boycotts, and this will be one of his first big jumps into the civil rights movement. He will have what he calls his soul force. Just to go a little bit into Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr. really felt that the way to protest was nonviolent protest. He believed violence was never the answer. He is going to get his ideas about protesting and ways to treat people from Henry David Thoreau, Jesus, Gandhi. Those were where these ideas were, and he really would tell his people, it doesn't matter what they do to you, you don't strike back. We don't have to have violence to protest and get things to change. So let's watch a short biography on MLK.
Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. Faith was always an important part of daily life, as both his father and grandfather were Baptist ministers. He thrived at a segregated high school, graduating at 15, before heading off to Morehouse College. He then dedicated 3 years to theological study at Crozier Seminary in Pennsylvania. While earning his graduate degree at Boston University, he met Coretta Scott, who he would marry and have 4 children with. King and his family settled in Montgomery, Alabama, when he became the 20th pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. When Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to relinquish her seat to a white man on a Montgomery City bus in 1955, the incident lit a fire under the burgeoning civil rights movement.
His boycott of the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama was tremendously successful because he was incredibly strategic, and he worked with other people to get the individuals in Montgomery, Alabama to understand that they weren't going to take it anymore.
King's experience, passion for the cause, and position in the community gave him the credentials to become a leader in the 381-day boycott of the city buses. On December 20th, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregated buses to be unconstitutional. This was a major victory for the civil rights cause and proved King's nonviolent methods of protest could yield results. King was now the national face of the civil rights cause. He was jailed over 20 times, was once stabbed in the chest, his house was bombed, and he suffered relentless personal attacks on himself and his family. For a man of peaceful intentions, he unfortunately spent much of his life the target of violent intent, yet the threats never stopped him.
Dr. King inspired thousands of people through his eloquence and through his fearlessness, especially after his home was firebombed with his wife and his children. They showed through their courage that they were prepared to give their lives to the cause of freedom.
King worked tirelessly to promote the cause he so strongly believed in. And from 1957 through 1968, he traveled over 6 million miles, delivered 2,500 speeches, wrote 5 books, and dozens of articles. His hard work and ability to communicate earned him such respect that he earned the ear of President John F. Kennedy, who personally met with King. Of all the speeches King delivered, none has stood the test of time like his famous I Have a Dream speech. Symbolically delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, in front of 250,000 people, both black and white. King had become such a force in America that he was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1963. A nice achievement indeed, but it paled in comparison when in 1964 he became the youngest man ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Martin Luther King Jr. was an American. He was deeply American. And what's striking to me is that he had more confidence and faith in American democracy, in the Constitution, and in the principles of fairness and opportunity than nearly all of his critics.
While in Memphis to lead a protest march defending the rights of striking garbage workers in April of 1968, King delivered a rousing speech titled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop." It would be his last. Standing on the balcony of his second-floor room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, King was shot and killed. In 1983, Ronald Reagan signed a proclamation declaring the third Monday of every January Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a public holiday to celebrate the man and what he stood for.
So that was just a little bit on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his path and journey to help gain equality for all peoples. We have what's called the Freedom Riders. Even though there was an anti-segregation, desegregation law that went into effect for buses, it wasn't being enforced. Like, the law officers were not making sure that anyone could ride the bus wherever they wanted. And so a group of people decide to take these trips on buses to force President Kennedy to have the federal government come in and make all of these states desegregate buses. And so they take these 2 bus trips, and they know they're going to be arrested. They know they're going to meet, some violence, and they do it anyway just to force the federal government, to come in and make states desegregate. There's some horrendous acts of violence, like their buses are blown up. They are met with billy clubs, bats. But what ends up happening is that the federal government will have to step in and desegregate. You're also going to see that there's going to be attempts to desegregate all manner of places, and one of these is going to be cafeterias, restaurants. This is a soda fountain, lunch counters, because African Americans in a lot of areas were not allowed to sit or even use the same doors as others. And so another version of nonviolent protest, in order to really push desegregation and get equality for everyone, is going to be what they called lunch counter sit-ins. And these mostly students would sit at these lunch counters where and they would sit there, and these other people would do these horrible things to try and get them to move and not have desegregation. And these kids who are sitting here are just going to take and let these people do whatever they're going to do to them as a nonviolent protest. And once again, trying to really push that desegregation. As we see more and more nonviolent protests, and we see violence against the civil rights movement, Kennedy is going to see that we need a new Civil Rights Act. And so what's going to happen is they're going to try and pass this new civil rights law, but in order to get it passed, they felt like they needed a huge show of support from the country. And so there is a march on D.C. that is organized. On August 28th of 1963, over 250,000 people will meet in D.C. to show their support for this new civil rights law. During this, Martin Luther King Jr. will give his very famous "I Have a Dream" speech as a way of showing what he envisions for the United States and equality for everyone. This is a picture of him giving that, and he gave that, if you didn't hear it in the video, at the Lincoln Memorial. So all of this really works together, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, and it prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. Next, we're going to see the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed.